sparkling or flat?
I'm good with nothing. On the plane, they serve you so much.
Oh, okay. Oh, you just flew it?
I did
Oh.
this morning.
All right, so I think we're streaming to the world and we're recording. So we're kind of ready to go. I'll try to not have my phone ring during the event, but I haven't actually silenced it at that end yet. So thank you very much for coming out. We have Larry Tye here on the left, and Greg Stern on the right. They'll be in conversation. As you know, this is the book, The Jazzmen. You guys can do the subtitle. I'll leave that to y'all. Thanks. Yeah, grab a seat. Grab a seat. We're going to get started. So yeah, we're very, very pleased to present this book. I don't need to go into detail because you're going to hear plenty from these gentlemen. Okay, thanks very much. And let me go back and make sure that we got a little. Oh, I'm going to turn on this speaker. There's a power strip there down by your that hand. Yeah, there's a switch on it, right where your fingers are. That ought to do it. And
Great.
we can amplify it a little bit. Okay, here
Great.
they go.
Thank you very much. And I need to express in advance that I'm going to need to run out at 4:20 because appropriately enough, I need to go down to Stanford to the Bing Center to introduce the Count Basie Orchestra, which SF Jazz is presenting tonight. So it's very much a Basie afternoon and evening for me. Welcome, Larry. Thank you for attending this.
So I'm delighted to be here, and I want to just say two quick things. One is a week ago I was in Red Bank, New Jersey. Anybody here been to Red Bank, New Jersey? Great. So if you haven't been, don't go. And if you've been, the only reason, no offense to Red Bank, to go there is where Count Basie was from. But I also want to just say I started this morning. I was up at 3:30 this morning on Cape Cod, and then as they're perpetually doing in Boston, one tunnel was out, so you never know how long it's going to take. And if you get up as early as I did, you're guaranteed there will be no traffic, and you didn't have to worry about the tunnel. But it is wonderful to be on this coast, and it's wonderful to be in a bookstore that, as somebody just pointed out, not only looks like a bookstore ought to look, but smells like one and just has the whole feeling of it. And I'm delighted that Greg, in his busy schedule, is here. And I'm delighted that the Count Basie band has a couple of younger members who actually played with Count Basie 250 years ago. And that was the...
Right, and they're no longer the younger members in the orchestra now. They're the elder statesmen. Well, why don't you actually read what the subtitle is so that those who have not yet read the book or are not familiar with it know who it's about?
Sure. So the subtitle is a claim that will decide, maybe we'll take a poll at the end of the talk here whether it justified the subtitle, but the title is The Jazzmen, and the subtitle is How Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. And that is a big claim to make, and we'll talk about it.
So if I could just ask you so we can get this question addressed at the very outset, what about the jazz women?
Good. So the question normally takes, you're too polite to say it this way, where the heck are the jazz women is part of the question, and the other is, who were you to decide that these were the three jazz men who belonged on Mount Rushmore? And the answer is, I picked these three partly because they were all born within 5 years of one another at the turn of the last century, partly because they came from different enough parts of America that they made my case that the transformation happened not just in one place, but across the country, and partly because they did something that you will do and that I will never do, which is having a career, staying at the top of a career for a full half century, which was unheard of in those days, and it's even more unheard of today, where people's careers last for 15 seconds and somebody new has gotten to the top of the mountain. But the reason there is, I want to encourage people to try out sometime. you all know that when you type on your PC or your Mac a particular word, if the dictionary doesn't recognize that word, it will automatically spell check the word. And I would like to suggest that you try out the word jazzmen, which the dictionary recognizes and it does not autocorrect. But if you try jazz women, it's like that doesn't exist. And it didn't exist ever with Merriam-Webster, and I think that the dictionary was reflecting what was going on in a wider world, that jazz women never had the credibility. If they weren't vocalists, then they had a very difficult time or an impossible time breaking into the profession. So the idea of finding women as instrumentalists was difficult. The idea of finding women as band leaders was almost impossible. And the idea of women being acknowledged as being of the same level as Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, even though there were women who were there at the same level, they never got the acknowledgement. And one of the only exceptions to that was a woman who, if I tell you her first two names, most of you probably won't recognize. And her name was Lillian Harden. But if I told you that it was Lillian Harden Armstrong, you might recognize, because she was Louis Armstrong's second of 4 wives. And she was amazing partly because she recognized when Louis Armstrong left New Orleans and went to Chicago, summoned there by the great King Oliver to be a sideman in his band, Lillian Armstrong said, I want you to be in the headlines. I want you to be taking home a paycheck like King Oliver does, and I want you to be a star. And he didn't believe in himself at that moment, but she believed in him. She was part of a set of jazz recordings that you're a much better scholar of jazz than I am, but that I think of as the best maybe ever, which were the so-called Hot Fives. Mm-hmm. And she was Hot Lil playing the piano in the Hot Fives. And she turned out to be a terrific piano player, a terrific arranger and composer and band leader. But she was also almost unique in that era, somebody doing all of those things. And she got exactly 0 press for most things, other than it being so unusual that she was out there doing all those things. And it was sad to me because even people who were as disparaged as the black musicians that I'm writing about, even them, they disparaged and called women who were the brilliant instrumentalists with them words like the canaries and thrushes. So these black women had a double stigma and not helped at all by the black men.
In addition to being an accomplished pianist, she was also his manager and publicist and really helped Lewis's career
and
tremendously.
Muse and everything. Yeah. Yes, she did everything. And what he rewarded her with was divorcing her as soon as he started taking off and going on to wife number 3, who had been mistress number 2 when he was married to Lil. And even, I want to just say that even with his 4th wife, who he stayed married to for about 40 years, he had perpetual mistresses. He was a very serious guy. He was a man of God who said he believed in the 10 Commandments and prayed before every meal. And we could go through each of the 10 Commandments one at a time and see which ones he broke. But the one about fidelity, he broke most regularly.
Well, and that's a theme in your book throughout about all of them, really. And it kind of goes with the territory. Before we move off of Louis Armstrong for a second, can you tell everybody why he wore a Jewish Star of David every day?
Sure. So all 3 of the guys that I wrote about had Jewish managers at one point during their lives, had Jewish bandmates, and had Jewish friends. But with Louis Armstrong, he was the embodiment to me of the Black-Jewish alliance of the last century, that people who are young enough would not even know that there had ever been a Black-Jewish alliance, and relations are so tense often today. But he was an embodiment of that, in part because of what happened to him as a young kid on the streets of New Orleans. He was out there having to hustle because his mother was trying to support himself and his sister. His father had taken off almost the day after he was born and really never showed up other than to father his sister and then to take off again. And so Louis Armstrong was out there in the streets doing any hustle he could. And one of the best hustles was with a family named Karnofsky, Lithuanian Jewish immigrants, who had what was known in the vernacular in New Orleans as a rag wagon and what was known in the Yiddish as a schmati wagon. And they were out there doing what a lot of Jewish immigrants did, which was peddling anything they could on their wagon. And they realized if we had somebody making some noise, and it was sort of nice noise, that might attract more people to our rag wagon. So they went and bought him the first horn that he ever had, and he tooted the horn, and they liked him enough that they would bring him home at night. And when Lily Karnofsky was making a great brisket dinner or whatever she was doing, she would invite Louis to stay. When she was singing Jewish lullabies, she would sing them to him as well as to her kids. And he was so taken by the family and by the music that they were creating that he said that the genesis of the music that he was creating was, as we know, partly church music and gospel music. It was partly blues, but it was also Jewish lullabies. And almost as much as the lullabies, he loved hearing Jewish men pray. And the word for that was davening. They were doing their, and he thought that was such a fascinating sound that he said that also worked into the music that he was playing. And he rewarded the Karnofskys with two things. One is for the rest of his life wearing a Star of David around his neck. And the other was in the third of his memoirs, he dedicated it to what he called the Jewish family from New Orleans, and they loved that.
Thank you. That's a great story. So the icons that you write about, each of them is known best, really, by his nickname, Count, Duke, Satchmo. Can you briefly touch on the origins of each?
Sure. So I want to start by saying, first of all, in your busy life, I'm impressed that most of the people who do this interlocutor stuff have not read the book. And I love that you have.
I haven't read the questions you gave
right,
me.
Exactly. They all, everybody else. So as an old journalist, you assume that journalists or people in the field who are interviewing you never really have time to read a book. And when you read a journalist's review of a book, assume that they read the introduction or the prologue, and that's about it. So I create questions, and I love that you're not using them. And so the nicknames, Duke and the Count both said, gave these long stories on where their nicknames came from. And the story changed a little with every journalist who was asking them. The truth is that Duke's nickname came from when he was a kid. And he grew up in Washington. He lived during his youth in Washington in 16 different houses. And his favorite house had a steep staircase. And in the morning, when he was on his way to school, he would march down this staircase very slowly. And he would tell his young nephews, who were at the bottom of the steps, bow to me. He would tell his young nieces, it's time for you to curtsy. And he would tell the adults and the children at the bottom of the stairs, applaud, applaud, because someday the world is going to know me as the great and the grand Duke Ellington. And all of his stories about what friend gave him the nickname and at what point in his life are entertaining and untrue. He dubbed himself the Duke. He understood from those days walking down the steps in his house that he was going to be royalty and aristocracy. He lived up to it, and he told a lot of great stories about it.
He was rather taken with himself from an early age.
Totally, from an early age and throughout the rest of his life, he was very taken with himself. The good news was, it was worthy. He was, this guy who could compose 6,000 songs and arrange and play a great piano and lead a band. Count Basie had a similar deal. He gave a million reasons why he was called Count Basie. The truth is, at a relatively early point in his career in Kansas City, which is where his career really took off, he decided that if Duke Ellington could be Duke, and if King Oliver could be a king, he was at least worthy of being a count. So he printed up business cards that said Count Basie, and he dubbed himself Count. Louis Armstrong had a million nicknames. He was called everything from Satchmo to Dippermouth to Little Louis,
Pops.
Which obviously, to Pops. Pops is the name he used when he couldn't remember somebody else's name. He would call them Pops. Little Louis was a commentary on the fact that this guy had a healthy appetite in terms of eating, and he was never Little Louis. And Satchmo was a name that a British journalist gave him when he stepped off the boat on his first trip to England, and he had been called Satchelmouth, and this guy sort of condensed it to Satchmo. But my favorite reaction of Lewis to his nicknames was when he said, "I don't care what the heck you call me, as long as you call me in time for dinner." And that was where he left it. And that was
So he had some interesting habits, Louis Armstrong, and proclivities, and in what he attributed his longevity and his fine health to. One of which resulted in a letter to President Eisenhower. Do you want to talk about those two
sure.
passions of his?
The only name that Lewis really objected to, the two names, were when he was called repeatedly an Uncle Tom. And he was called an Uncle Tom because he would, in his performances, and especially when he was on TV, he'd pull out a million handkerchiefs and he would ham it up on the stage. And he saw nothing contradictory between being an artist and being an entertainer, but the world did, and a lot of journalists did. And they called him an Uncle Tom, and when they really wanted to get to him, they called him an Aunt Jemima. And he showed in 1957, in the incident that you're talking about, what his true feelings were on race. He first of all didn't think that he had to justify anything. This guy who had grown up in deep South Jim Crow New Orleans, and who had been told from the time he was a kid, this is the water fountain that coloreds can use, and this is the one for whites. This is the park that blacks can use, the second-rate park, and this is the one for whites. The idea that he had to justify to white America that he was not an Uncle Tom seemed nuts to him. But he finally lost it one day in 1957. If you remember back to 57, the landmark civil rights issue in 1957 was in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it was when 9 black kids, who became known as the Little Rock Nine, were told by a federal court, you will integrate the all-white Central High School. And the governor of Arkansas, who was a racist in the mode of lots of people that I could think of today, but in the mode back then of George Wallace, a guy named Orville Faubus, essentially said, you will integrate this high school over my dead body. And our war hero president, Dwight Eisenhower, said, I'm not going to send in federal troops. It's up to the state and the locality to protect these kids. And a young journalist, in the scoop of a lifetime, in a scoop that made this young journalist's career, went to Louis Armstrong's hotel and he said, what do you think about what's going on in Little Rock? Expecting to get some diplomatic and unusable answer. And instead, Louis Armstrong took off. He called Orville Faubus a word that begins with M and ends with R and has, I'm not sure how many letters, but it has the word mother in it somewhere. And that, in a family newspaper, ended up being translated to an uneducated plowboy. They weren't going to use the M word, but they called him that. He called Dwight Eisenhower gutless, and that did make it into the newspaper. And something incredible happened. On the one hand, looking back cynically, what happened was a lot of the people who had called him an Uncle Tom now called him an unpatriotic American and said, who are you to call our president gutless? But the one person who was listening to him was the guy in the White House, Dwight Eisenhower. And I can't prove a causal connection, but I'm convinced that Dwight Eisenhower sent in the federal troops that he quickly sent in to Little Rock because he had been called out by the guy that he adored, Louis Armstrong, who said he was being gutless. And Eisenhower recognized that he was truly being gutless.
I was reading 2 books concurrently, not to pitch another author here, but J.T. English, Dangerous Rhythms, which is all about the influence of the mob on jazz. Not the influence, but the intersection between organized crime and jazz. And there's a lot of intersections between what you write about and what he has written about. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and in particular, how that influenced the 3 principles in your book.
Great. So back then, you remember when the Jazz Age was, and the beginning of the Jazz Age coincided with Prohibition. And so what mobsters would do, the way you made your money was you bootlegged liquor when you couldn't make it legally, and you sold it in what they called speakeasies when you couldn't sell it legally. Only these guys like Al Capone and Dutch Schultz And in Kansas City, the maybe biggest manipulator of all, a guy named Tom Pendergast, who was the boss of Kansas City, the way he figured you would attract people to come to his speakeasy, or all of these speakeasies, was the same way the Karnofskys attracted people to come to their schmati wagon, which was you had good music. And he brought in Kansas City, Pendergast and his crew brought into a place called the Reno Club, a band. Reno Club was a total dive bar, and they brought in a band called the Basie Band. And in Chicago, it was Louis Armstrong. In New York, it was a guy named Owen Madney, who owned the best of the speakeasies of that era, which was called the Harlem Club up in Harlem. And they brought them in, they played great music, but what made the difference was they had microphones like this. Nobody would have ever heard of. Count Basie would have probably died a drunk in the streets of Kansas City if they hadn't had a recording studio set up there where his music was being broadcast across America. And a guy named John Hammond was driving around in New York and heard this amazing recording from the Reno Club. And the way Hammond tells it, and this is only partly embellished, is that the next 5 minutes he was on a plane to Kansas City and he signed up Count Basie. Well, it wasn't 5 minutes, but it was pretty quick. And he did capture Count Basie from dereliction and obscurity in Kansas City and made him a big deal. In the Cotton Club, the microphone carried it in the opposite direction. In places like Iowa and Nebraska, people in their living rooms could hear the Duke Ellington Band. And you can bet when they went to New York, one of the places they were guaranteed to go was up to Harlem to hear the Ellington Band. And Duke Ellington was willing to put up with that, even though the mobsters who ran the Cotton Club decided in their total racial sensitivity to have the Cotton Club set up as a plantation motif and to call Ellington's music jungle music. He was starting out, he had no choice. He did it at the Cotton Club, and when he could get away from the Cotton Club, he went away and didn't come back. But
that was completely new information to me from your book. I was unaware of that. You wrote about how Louis Armstrong in New Orleans, when he was first starting out, realized that the venues that were mob-aligned were safer because they had muscle.
They were. And so Louis Armstrong hired as his longest-serving manager a Jewish character from the Chicago named Joe Glazer. And the reason he hired Joe Glazer was because Joe Glazer was the one, when the mobsters came after Armstrong, which they did repeatedly, Joe Glazer was as tough as the mobsters. He was a mobster himself. He had modeled himself on Al Capone, and he could stand up to the tough guys, and they all needed protection because you didn't work in this mob-infused world unless you had your tough guy who could stand up to their tough guy.
Your book is really thoroughly researched, and particularly some of the lineage with Count Basie, with Bill Basie, family stuff that he never really acknowledged. Can you talk about that, and in particular how that might have impacted who he was once he became famous?
So I would love to talk about that. I also want to say that the Count Basie, all of Count Basie's memorabilia from his whole life was donated to the Institute for Jazz Studies, which is this brilliant place at Rutgers, one of the best jazz research institutes anywhere.
Wayne
Winborn. Believe everything that they tell you at that institute, except when they post on their website and talk to you about Count Basie's biography, because they got it wrong. And they got it wrong because Count Basie was so secretive. Count Basie wrote a memoir called Good Morning Blues, and I'm convinced there are 3 people in the world who have read that memoir. Count Basie, the writer who worked with him, who was a brilliant writer. Why am I blanking on who was the? I'll think of his name in a minute. And me, I'm the third one. And the reason
Hentoff or no?
Not Hentoff. It was anyway. I'll remember his name. But the Murray. What was the? But the reason nobody read it is that it was deadly. And every time he would get to an interesting point in a story, he would say, I don't have to tell you that, or I'm not going to wash this dirty laundry, or whatever it was. And by the end of it, you were left with a terrible travelogue. And it was just deadly. And that was because I think, of the thing that you were trying to steer me to and that we'll talk about, which is that Count Basie grew up with secrecy surrounding what happened in his family. He had had two older brothers, but he only knew for most of his youth about one older brother who died tragically of disease in his teenage years or maybe a bit younger. But he didn't know that he had another brother who was born out of wedlock, who was farmed out to a black fortune teller in town to raise this boy, and at age 6 he died of malnutrition. And that was one of a series of tragedies in Count Basie's youth that I would love to say that I was smart enough as an old journalist and a researcher to dig up all of this stuff. Well, I was smart enough to hire a really smart genealogist who was a lot smarter than me. And I started out writing this book as a cynic about genealogy. And I thought they were people who just went out there because they were often retirees who had nothing better to do, and they went out and looked at their family trees and put together family trees. I discovered that serious genealogists know how to do serious research. And this woman was brilliant in going out. Every week she would get back to me and say, I found something else that you might be interested in. And I'm having a brilliant time just reading all of her notes telling me, well, I think that this child was here. And he was called, the brother who died of malnutrition was called Samuel Basin, B-A-S-O-N. Not exactly a brilliant job of disguising his roots, but then I had researchers who went with me. We went looking for this kid's gravestone in the graveyard that Basie and his parents were buried in. And the bottom line is, his story tells us who he was. Each of these people, not surprisingly, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but each of these people were shaped by their youth, shaped by the fact that they were raised by mothers and their fathers either disappeared at a young age or just weren't part of their real upbringing, shaped by the fact that either they were told, as Ellington was, you are royalty at a young age, or told, like Louis Armstrong was, you've got to go out and earn a living because I'm out trying to sell my body, which is what Armstrong told us his mother had to do to put food on his table. Or in Count Basie's case, you were told simply, shh. Mm-hmm. And that determined who he was. And I think it made him a brilliant band leader because he didn't want to talk about himself. He wanted to bring in his bandmates. He didn't need to hog the spotlight, but it made him also really quiet and mysterious. And it'll be interesting to ask the Basie band tonight, do they know anything about their namesake?
So the notion of the three of them providing the soundtrack for the civil rights movement is an interesting idea that you put in the book. One could definitely see it with Duke Ellington and with some of his compositions. What's the case for all three of them, and in particular for Basie and Armstrong?
Sure. So if I could take 1 minute with each of them and explain the kind of racism. So it's not surprising that black men who grew up in an era when, in the post-Reconstruction era, when racism was rampant in America, that they experienced racism. But I want to just give you really quick anecdotes with what happened with each of them at a time later in their careers when they were arguably the most famous American musicians in the world. They used to say in the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, the two most recognizable symbols of American culture in the world were Mickey Mouse and Louis Armstrong. And I'm not sure it was in that order. And yet this is what they experienced. With Louis Armstrong, he could be the headliner at a nightclub in Las Vegas, and yet he always had to go in through the kitchen because that was the only entrance that blacks were allowed to go into those fancy nightclubs in New Orleans, in Las Vegas. With Count Basie, one night in Philadelphia, he got 10 standing ovations in this big theater he was playing in. But when he came out of the theater at the end of the night, a white guy tossed him the car keys and said, "Go get me my car, valet." With Duke Ellington, it was a case where he was in Lynchburg, Virginia, and normally either using a green book or just this informal network, he would know where it was safe for a black man to stay in a place like Lynchburg, Virginia. In Lynchburg, he didn't know a place. and his manager went out looking for a hotel that was willing to accept the great Duke Ellington after he had done again, a sold-out performance in town. And the owner of a white hotel finally agreed that he would let Duke Ellington stay there. But he said, you will of course have to pay an extra charge for the pillowcases and the sheets, because after a black man sleeps in this hotel, we're going to have to burn them. This is what they faced, and all three of them said throughout their careers, we want our music to speak for itself. Duke Ellington composed things like Black, Brown, and Beige, which told the stories of black in America. He composed a brilliant play and a song called King Fit the Battle of Alabama. And this was about when young black demonstrators had a guy named Bull Connor, the police chief in Birmingham, turn the hoses on them. And Ellington was so outraged that he wrote a song about that. And they said, that's all we have to do. But then they did something different. Louis Armstrong did what we've already talked about. He called our war hero president a gutless bastard. And he changed things. Count Basie, beginning in 1945, very, very early, at the end of World War II, he put a clause in his contracts that essentially boiled down to no integrated audience, no integrated band, no Count Basie play there. And he, 20 years before Duke Ellington had the courage to do the same thing, said, I will demand integration in the one place that I can control it, which is the venues I'm playing in. Duke Ellington did something different. He was in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins playing, and they were trying to integrate a whites-only restaurant called the Blue Dove Diner, I think it was called, the Blue Jay Diner. And the sit-in students said, Duke, will you join us? And Duke said no. They said, Duke, pretty please, will you join us in our sit-in? And he said, no way. They asked him a third time, and it worked magic. He joined them in the sit-in. The pictures in newspapers the next day were a Baltimore cop escorting Duke Ellington out of this diner where he was essentially being arrested. And that made headlines everywhere, and it integrated the Blue Jay Diner in the way the students couldn't do. All three of these guys were pushed over a limit and decided our music is not enough, we are going to act. And I would say that in an era where musicians are worried that it will spoil their image or eat into their audience if they say anything that's too controversial, it could have not only gotten these guys arrested, it could have gotten them at the end of a lynching noose to do what they did in the heart of Jim Crow territory in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
How did it reconcile with their roles as ambassadors? Because they were also leveraged by the government as goodwill ambassadors, both in the U.S. and abroad.
So can I answer that question and answer another one at the same time that you haven't asked? So the reason that I was intrigued by these guys' story is that 20 years ago, I wrote a book on some black men who worked on the railroads in America who were called Pullman porters. And from the end of the Civil War to the 1960s, the best job a black man could get in America in terms of their salary and in terms of getting to see the country and hobnob with the people who ran the country was in these elegant sleeping cars called Pullman cars. And when Duke, Louis, and the Count had enough money, which was 40s, 50s, and 60s, when they went south, they knew that if they went into the wrong restaurant and tried to ask to be served or tried to get a room in the wrong hotel, they could be berated, they could be beaten, or they could be killed. And so what they did when they went south is they hired private Pullman sleeping cars to go with them in the south. And if they were performing a concert in a place like Atlanta, the car would be pulled off on a sidetrack, and they'd go do their concert. And at the end of the night, they knew when they went back to their Pullman sleeping car, they would have a brilliant meal made by the dining car staff. They would have a plush bed made by the Pullman porters, and they would have a place where they could be safe. And what they did in return was they played in the middle of the night a private jam session just for the Pullman porters. And Greg, I don't know about you, but if I could go back to any moment in history, it'd be a pretty nice time to go in the closed capsule of this sleeping car to have Duke Ellington performing just for us. But the question you asked was...
reconciling the ambassadorial role.
So this is at a moment when we're in a superheated Cold War at the end of the 1950s and the early 1960s. And I don't know what you remember, if you lived through it or if you read about it in your civics class, what that Cold War was like. But the issue that we were most vulnerable on as a country, and the issue that the Soviets used repeatedly with unaligned nations to convince them that we were bad guys and they were good guys, was the issue of racism in America. And so some very smart people in the Eisenhower administration and a guy named Adam Clayton Powell in Congress and then the Kennedy administration realized, who could we send overseas to make the case for us? Well, why don't we send three of the most recognizable black faces in America, Armstrong, Ellington, and Basie. So they sent them as informal U.S. ambassadors. They sent them to Africa. They sent them to Latin America. And most effectively, they sent them behind the Iron Curtain. They drew crowds in the thousands. And when cynical reporters were asking them, what about racism in America? And how would you want to be an ambassador for a racist country? These three guys did what used to be a guarantee that we had for a long time a bipartisan foreign policy, where when you went overseas, anything you said in America, you would tone down because you were playing to the world. And these three guys said something brilliant. They said, yes, we have racism, but we are fixing it. The perfect thing. If they had denied racism, nobody would have believed them. But if they had denied that we were at least trying to do something that they were a part of, so they were the most effective ambassadors we had, and they loved their roles enough that all three of them thought about being expatriates and never coming back to that racist country, but they were too American to do that.
Well, they wouldn't have been the first jazz musicians to embark for Europe and live there.
They wouldn't have been.
So they're of the same era, born within 10 years or less of each other from different parts of the country, icons at the same time, but they had little interaction with each other. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So this is something that people who are a lot smarter than me will dispute, but I stand by because nobody can prove them right or me wrong. I think the reason they didn't interact more is because, first of all, they were incredibly different guys. Louis Armstrong was an over-the-top, wearing his heart in his trumpet and in his voice and in everything he did. Duke Ellington was the classic aristocrat who spoke a very different language, a different form of English than Louis Armstrong, and who saw himself as a different ilk. And Count Basie didn't want anybody to know what he was. So they were three different guys who in normal circumstances probably wouldn't have gotten along well. More importantly, we can see from these lights here and from any spotlight, any light only shines so far. And if you're Duke Ellington, why share a stage with Louis Armstrong or Count Basie, who would require part of that spotlight on them? I think it was all about their egos, and they didn't have to share a stage with anybody, and they didn't want to. So when a reporter would ask Ellington what he thought of Armstrong, or Armstrong what he thought of Basie, they would speak glowingly, but their actions told what they really thought, and they didn't need to or want to have much to do with one another.
So let's talk about the music. Signature songs in the beginning of their career, and then throughout, and particularly at the end of the career. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Sure, and their songs said a lot about them, and thank you for asking about that. And their signature song for Duke Ellington, for much of his career, was a song that if I were to ask people, what one song do you associate with Ellington? What one song? That's good. Even more than that. Take the A-Train. Great. So Take the A-Train was an interesting song. That is, Ellington played it in every concert he ever gave once that song came along. And the song was, I don't know if you know the origin story, but a very quick version of the origin story. A very smart young guy named Billy Strayhorn was living in Pittsburgh. And Ellington had told Strayhorn, when you graduate, call me, and I'll invite you up to have a job interview. And Strayhorn called him 5 seconds after he graduated, and Ellington invited him to come to New York. And part of getting to Harlem meant take the A-Train. So Strayhorn was smart enough and precocious enough. he thought, if I can turn those directions into a song, Duke will hire me. It worked. He hired him, and I would say about one of every 3 times Ellington bothered to credit Strayhorn with that song, and the other 2/3 people assumed that was one of Duke's 6,000 compositions. But if that was his trademark early on, his trademark in the end, to me at least, was the song I mentioned before, King Fit the Battle of Alabama, because it was Duke Ellington saying, I've had enough. And A Train is a polite song and a wonderful song that you want to tap your toes to, but the song that tells who I really am today is the song about Birmingham. With Count Basie, the song at the beginning was a song called 1 O'Clock Jump. And they used to say about Count Basie generally, and specifically about 1 O'Clock Jump, that if you heard that song and your toes weren't tapping, you ought to go see a doctor, because something was anatomically wrong with you. And that song made you swing, made you tap, made you do what venues wanted, which was get up on the dance floor and dance. But by the end of his career, it was a song that I just saw that there's a movie that's been named this now, which was Fly Me to the Moon. And Fly Me to the Moon was a song that the Basie Band played, that in its best version Frank Sinatra sang, and that went up with the Apollo astronauts. It was not called Fly Me to the Moon because he was envisioning that they would take it up with him, but they just liked the song. And in those days, if you'll remember back to the Apollo era, guys like Walter Cronkite were sitting in New York at Mission Control Central or wherever they were, and they were having perpetual conversation with the Apollo astronauts. And they said once, what are you listening to? And they said, we're listening to these tapes that we made to come up with us, and we're listening to Fly Me to the Moon. And the next 5 minutes, that song flew to the top of the charts because everybody who was listening to Apollo heard that song. With Louis Armstrong, the song at the beginning of his career was a very controversial song. And it was a song called When It's Sleepy Time Down South. And he would play that every performance. And that song seemed to be sentimentalizing plantation life. Louis Armstrong grew up in that Jim Crow world, and he sure as heck wasn't sentimentalizing it, but he was explaining it. And that song captured what life was like in the racist South that he grew up in. And the more people pushed him to stop singing it, the more he insisted on singing it. One time he decided to have fun with his white critics, and he called the song, he renamed it. Instead of When It's Sleepy Time Down South, he renamed it When It Is Slavery Time Down South. And that's what he really was saying in that song all along. But if that was a song at the beginning, at the end, Louis Armstrong had gone pop. And the song he was most known for at the end of his life was Hello Dolly. He took a song that is as mediocre or worse song as you can imagine, and in Louis Armstrong's hand, with his trumpet and more importantly with his singing, that song took off. It sold 3 million records, and at age 63, Louis Armstrong bumped the Beatles from #1 on the Billboard charts because Hello Dolly was taking its place. One last thing about Louis Armstrong and his singing. We all know him for his trumpet playing. He had, as you know, a voice. Anybody have an adjective you'd use to describe Louis Armstrong's voice?
Raspy, gravelly.
Raspy. So, rasp and gravel, perfect 2 adjectives. The idea that his voice became the most recognizable voice on the planet was unusual. More unusual was what kids did in Chicago when he was starting out and his singing had started to catch on. Kids would, in the middle of winter, stick their head out of their car trying to catch cold so they could sound like Louis Armstrong. It was magic.
I have very distinct memories of being 10 years old, watching Louis Armstrong in black and white on the Ed Sullivan Show, doing Hello Dolly.
Me too, and I have distinct memories of thinking that Louis Armstrong was an Uncle Tom, and my book was written partly as a mea culpa, that I got him wrong, and so did too big a part of America.
So we all know that particularly with R&B and jazz, black artists were managed ineffectively or outright corruptly, where they did not keep many of their earnings. Was that true of these three icons as their careers progressed?
So it was true of them as their careers progressed, and they had three different reactions to it. Louis Armstrong's reaction was classic Louis. He said, I know Joe Glazer is stealing from me, but as long as he keeps me in the money, keeps my wife happy with this home that we own, and as long as I have money to give away to people, throw around or spending money, I don't care. He's entitled to do some stealing. So he knew that was happening. Count Basie, in classic Count Basie fashion, mentioned it on page 393 of his memoir and sort of said, yeah, people over the years have taken money, but he had no proof and he wasn't going to do anything about it. And so he just did it under cover and quietly. And Duke Ellington, realizing that his managers were probably stealing from him, did something that was classic Duke. And it breaks my heart to this point. Still, he hired his son, Mercer Ellington, who has a successful career as a disc jockey. He said, Mercer, I want you to come and play in the band, and I want you to be my manager, because you're the only one I can only trust family. So Mercer had to give up his career. He came in and played with and managed the band, and he knew that Duke, for Mercer's entire life, looked at Mercer as second rate, never living up to himself. And I got an amazing tour of Duke Ellington's Harlem from a woman named Mercedes Ellington, who was Mercer's daughter, who told me about Mercer's broken heart. And the interesting thing about that tour was she took me to everywhere that Duke Ellington had played, which was a lot of places. She took me to everywhere where Duke Ellington lived, which was a lot of places. But the biggest chunk of our tour was everywhere that he had stashed a mistress across Harlem. And Duke Ellington, who's the only one of our three who stayed married to the same woman all of his life, had 10 mistresses at any given time. And he stayed married to the same woman because they didn't live together as husband and wife after the first 2 or 3 years. But he had the perfect excuse. When one of his mistresses said, marry me, he could say, I'm already married and you don't want me to go through an expensive divorce. And it worked. And the woman who is buried next to Duke Ellington at this brilliant cemetery in the Bronx is his favorite mistress, who used to put on her doorbell the Evie Ellington. And the New York Times, the brilliant New York Times, which gets everything right, called her with the last name Ellington in her obituary and in his obituary, which of course she was never Ellington.
In writing the book, did you go to the Louis Armstrong Museum in Queens?
So in writing the book, I went to the Louis Armstrong Museum, and 2 weeks ago I went back to the Louis Armstrong Museum. And the amazing thing about this museum is it was always a brilliant museum. The perfect museum is not one where you get a lot of memorabilia from somebody's life and you put it in a sterile building. It's when you actually have something in the museum itself that is a piece of who the person was. And Louis Armstrong Museum is the house that he lived in for much of his adult life. The house where every morning of his life he spent 30 minutes in a bathroom with mirrors all around the bathroom. He called it his throne. And he spent 30 minutes in there getting high. He would roll a very fat joint and get high. He would spend 30 minutes in whatever dressing room he was in around the country, another 30 minutes getting high again. And that getting high, I point out, because it wasn't only that Louis Armstrong loved marijuana, and he wrote an entire memoir that was almost entirely about marijuana, his love of marijuana, but it was also because he had such stress. He was working 300 days of the year. He was facing racism wherever he went, and getting high in the morning and getting high at night was the way he cooled off and relieved his stress. But if you are in Queens, you've got to go to this museum because it has everything from Louis's life, but across the street in this brilliant new $5 million building, it has all of his archives. So it's the perfect kind of museum. If you're there to do research, it's got a research place. And if you're there to get a sense of who Louis Armstrong was, you see not one change made. The house looks like, for those of you who are old enough to get this reference, it looks like an old cartoon when I was growing up called The Jetsons. And it had a space-age kitchen, and everything about it sort of suggests that Louis Armstrong was cutting edge.
and the archives, he incessantly, obsessively recorded everything on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Conversations, dinner, music. He just constantly recorded.
Sex.
And saved all the sex. I didn't know that. The other letter that he wrote to Eisenhower was advocating legalization of weed, by the way. Okay, I'm going to need to go in just a second down to Basie. Make the case. This could have been Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday, so many other people. Why these three in the Jazzmen?
So I could be glib and say that the Miles Davis, and I'm trying to remember which of the three he said it about. I think it was Louis Armstrong, but it may have been Ellington. He said simply, no him, no me. And all of these guys would have said the same thing. Sadly, they all lived too short of lives. They were at the top of their profession, everybody you've mentioned, and a dozen others that you know better than anybody, but they weren't around long enough. They didn't have the poetry of taking us through the full century. And in the end, it was subjective. I asked everybody, I interviewed for the book 250 people, from jazz fans like Bill Clinton to jazz impresarios like Marsalis and Batiste and twice Sonny Rollins. And I asked all of them. And the only three that all of them could agree on was these three. So it was my thing, and I'm not nearly smart enough to have made the right choice without help from smart people like you.
But it gives you an opportunity for volume 2 as well.
It, absolutely, right? And 3 and 4 and
All right, well, I'm sorry, I do need to go, which means we can open it up to Q&A from the folks who are here. But Larry, I just want to thank you. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Not until we say thank you to you for giving up you're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed
Appreciate it. Nice meeting both of you. So, any questions before our music? Eric will pull the plug at some point on everything but the, and before I forget, I want to just say, Eric, who owns this bookstore, is an amazing guy. He had no idea who in the world I was. He runs a brilliant bookstore, and he's a really good guy. So buy lots of his books. Question, sorry.
One of the anecdotes I thought was interesting toward the end of the book was about dinner with presidents. You know, when they could come to the White House, when it was actually acceptable, I guess I would argue, for them to have dinner with the president. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of those stories.
Sure. So I was surprised initially when I was doing the book that Richard Nixon had entertained on his 70th birthday, I can't remember what birthday of Duke's, but entertained him at the White House and really pulled out all the stops. And then I remembered from other books that I'd written that it was, the Republican Party was the party of blacks. It was the party of Lincoln until Jack Kennedy's day. Jack Kennedy reversed the historic allegiance that blacks had to a Republican Party, and that was a big factor in why he, in a very narrowly decided election, beat Richard Nixon in 1960. But these guys, it was both sides of the aisle that invited them, and they invited them partly because they love jazz. Richard Nixon said in a relatively early point in the evening, Pat and I are going to bed, and Duke, you can have the house. And so they played music and they danced and everybody had fun, and probably more fun because Richard Nixon had gone to bed. But I think everybody loved Ellington. LBJ had them in. The Basie band played one of the inaugurals for Jack Kennedy. But I want to say one other president. I did a weird thing. Last book was a biography of a guy named Joe McCarthy. And this book was, having spent 3 years with Joe McCarthy, my reward to myself and my publisher's reward to me was getting to spend 3 years with these guys. But in the book came out during the pandemic, and all the talks were on Zoom, and we weren't doing anything live. And in this tiny village I live in on Cape Cod called Cotuit, we had in the middle of the pandemic, a coming out party. Everybody was tired of being not being able to gather as a group. So the only place safe to have it, there's something called the Cape Cod Baseball League, and we had it in Cotuit's stadium, where we had a jazz band in the infield, and we had the bleachers where people sat. And then I get done with this. It was a wonderful sense of people coming together, even in the midst of COVID. And I get home, and there's a voicemail. And the voicemail says, "This is Bill Clinton's press secretary. Would you call? The president wants to talk to you." And I was trying to think which of my friends from the Boston Globe was calling pretending to be Bill Clinton. So I called the number, and this guy said, "Hold on for the president." Now, you can mimic a lot of voices, but you can't mimic. Bill Clinton has a voice like Louis Armstrong that nobody can duplicate. And he called, it turned out, to talk about Joe McCarthy. He had grown up in the McCarthy era, and he had gotten a hold of the book somewhere, and he wanted to talk about Joe McCarthy until he found out what the next book was. And then I had to eventually tell him that I had somewhere that I had to go, because he obviously doesn't have big audiences these days, and he likes to talk a lot. And he told me that he grew up loving Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, and that he had posters of them at his home and in his office. And he promised to show me when the pandemic was over, take me around and show me those posters. Well, he gave me a great interview, and he was wonderful to talk to. And every time I go to New York, I call his press secretary, reminding that the president made that promise. And every time they invent another place where he is out of town, so they don't have to make that happen. He's a politician, and you make promises. But it convinced me that when people talk about these three guys, that they are passionate. And Bill Clinton wasn't faking his passion for them. And it reminded me of what I did. The only person that I've ever written about that people had the same passion for half a century later was Bobby Kennedy. You do a talk on Jack Kennedy or on Ted Kennedy or on Bobby Jr., can I say, or I shouldn't say, and people respected Ted Kennedy and liked Jack Kennedy as president. Bobby Kennedy, half a century later, people are still looking for another incarnation of Bobby Kennedy. And it's the same thing with these jazz guys. It took me forever to get Wynton Marsalis on the telephone, but when we got done, I realized he was so passionate about them. He was giving me a cell phone number and saying, "Call me anytime." It wasn't because he knew or cared about who I was. It was that he wanted to talk about Ellington, Armstrong, and even Count Basie. Any other questions? Bruce?
Larry, not a question, a quick comment. Louis Armstrong played at a high school in my hometown, Hayward, of all places. I grew up in Hayward first 10 years, and it was a big school. It was voted the most beautiful high school in America, which is hard to believe, but it's true. And my Jim, who lived next door, was kind of a crazy character, and we went up because we knew how to break into the gym and get free Coca-Cola. So we went in, and there was this big sign, Louis Armstrong appearing Friday night. So Jim, who had no qualms about doing ridiculous things, ran in, and there was the Armstrong band, and they had a break, and there was Louis Armstrong. So we went up, and Jim, "Hey, how are you?" And I didn't know too much about Louis Armstrong. I had seen him in a film, High Society. So meeting any movie star to me was a big deal. Well, these guys were taking a break, and Armstrong came over, and he was talking to us for a while, and then Jim, being the way he was, ran over and grabbed Louis Armstrong's trumpet and proceeded, of course, to drop it. And it hit the ground and rolled down these little stairs where the band walked down. Well, we didn't see his show because I ran for like 3 weeks. I mean, we ran so fast, and the band members were laughing and everything, but I had to tell you that story.
So I love that story, and I want to tell you a very quick story about Louis Armstrong's trumpet today. The Louis Armstrong House and Museum in Queens was going to do a fundraiser, and they figured there was this guy who lived not far away named Paul McCartney who could help them with their fundraising. And Paul McCartney said, "I will do it on one condition. If you lend me one of Louis Armstrong's trumpet for a weekend so I can blow on my idol Louis Armstrong's trumpet, I will do whatever you want with fundraising." They lent him the trumpet, and they raised a pile of cash. And people from Bob Dylan to McCartney to everybody realized they were standing on the shoulders of jazz generally, and especially on the shoulders of these three guys.
We're going to have to actually, one very last question
Great.
and a short answer.
Very short answer.
All right, I have one thing that I haven't finished the book, Larry, but I love the discussion about the different styles of the way Count Basie and the Duke ran their bands. And two-part question is, do you see that coming from the way they were brought up and their background, number one, and number two, what were the manifestations of the music that reflected the different styles?
So I see that totally as a reflection of who they were. Count Basie wanted to share. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. He wanted to share it with his band. So people who went on to Count Basie's band stayed forever, including right now tonight in Palo Alto, that the Basie band with a couple of those people is still there. Duke, much too big an ego to share it. And what it meant was Duke Ellington's band was there, paid 365 days a year, so Duke could hear his compositions played immediately. But it was less about who the band was. Basie was all about the band, and they adored him for it. I want to say one last thing in ending, which is there's an unwritten rule in bookstore talks that when somebody opens up their bookstore for the evening like this, that people who come in and get free entertainment buy a book. I don't want to be arrogant enough to tell you that you have to buy my book. Buy some book of his before you go here tonight, because he's been great in opening it up to us. Thank you. Thank
Indeed. So, are you going to stick around for a minute to sign a book if anybody wants? Why don't you do it back there? I set up a chair near the door. You all can give me money for a book when you get a chance. I'm going to get this other band started. First, we're going to turn off this speaker. You can pay for the book after it's been signed. Then I can charge you extra money for it. And do let those musicians roll through that aisle if you all would.
Oh, so you have Joel Sylvan's Arhoolie book.
Yeah, I suppose I do. I can't really chat right now, though.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks, Art.
Thank you very much. Yeah. All right, gentlemen, if you want to bring your gear back, I think we could accommodate you. Hey, Mitch. Is Paul in the room? Is Paul here yet? Is Paul here yet? Hey. Good. Let's send him back first, and we'll get him situated for the drum kit. And then Joe will get you going here. How you doing, Rich?
So excited
Yeah.
to be debuting here, man.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric.
Oh, absolutely. It is a pleasure and an honor.
I wasn't sure how it was shaking out with the seducers, and when I found out that it was actually going to work, I was like, oh shit, this is good.
All right, great. So we can set up the drums there in front of that, and I'll get this clear for Joe to get his thing in, and then the rest of it will fall.
How should people pay?
They'll pay me. I'll be there in just a minute. They can get it signed first. I'll be there in just a minute. They can browse in the meantime. All right. Okay, the stage is getting pretty clear, so feel free to come this way.
Awesome, Eric.
Yeah. Alright. And once I get those two chairs off of there, I think we're pretty good. Think you can find your way to that corner, as per usual?
Yeah, my guide dog.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe.
We have a
How's it going,
laser
man?
pointer. Hey,
Yeah.
Paul. Welcome.
Hi, Eric. How are you?
I'm good. So glad to have you here. Give
I heard
yourself
the
a
conversation online. It was very
Good,
interesting.
good.
Enjoyed it.
Okay, there's a power strip and space to do your thing. Alright.
Yeah, well, you can't go wrong. How's it been?
Yeah, good.
too.
Yeah, all right.